The development of face. It's a very important question for the university exam and in the practical exam. By the end of the third week, the trilaminar germ layer is formed, and we can see the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. So this is when we are looking from the above, we can see the ectoderm. So towards the cephalic region, this is the cephalic region, and this is the caudal region. Caudal region means towards the tail. Cephalic region means towards the head. So anteriorly we have the precaudal plate, and caudally we have the cloacal membrane. Cloacal membrane. So between the precaudal plate and the cloacal membrane, you have a formation of tube, and that is the neural tube. Underlying that, you are having the notochord. So here, when you are taking a section like this, you will get something like this. That is, here you have the ectoderm and endoderm and the mesoderm. So it will be somewhat like this. This one is the ectoderm, this one is the endoderm, and here you can see the mesoderm. And here you can see that cephalically this is the cephalic region and this is the caudal region. And you can see that the mesoderm is not going in between them, and then cephalic and the caudal region. So cephalically you can call this as the precaudal plate, and caudally you can call this as the cloacal membrane. And one more thing I like to add is that the mesoderm is not present at the precaudal plate region as well as the cloacal membrane, where these will be so near, but it is present at these two regions. Only at the region of the precaudal plate and the cloacal membrane the mesoderm is not present. So cephalic to the precaudal plate, here this one, that mesoderm, it forms the pericardial bar, and the neural tube is present within the intraembryonic mesoderm between the precaudal plate and the cloacal membrane. So in this precaudal plate, it is actually representing the future mouth, and the cloacal membrane, it is representing the future anal region. So the heart must not be present cephalically, right? So this must fold. So it folds like this. So this is called the cephalic folding. It folds like that, so that the pericardial bar means it is the heart region of the future, in the future adult position. So after folding, it will be like this. The heart will come here. So this is actually the lateral view of the embryo. So this heart bulge, it forms the future heart. So this is the frontal view. You can see that there is a, here you can see that there is a dip which is formed at the region of precaudal plate or the buccopharyngeal membrane, and that is called the stomatium. This will become your future mouth region. During the same time, our neural tube is developing. That is at the fourth week. So it will develop brain vesicles. You can see that the prosencephalon, mesencephalon, rhombencephalon, which are the developing brain vesicles. So when the brain vesicles are developing, it pushes some of the mesoderm towards anteriorly, and this is actually called as the frontonasal process. So here you can see this is the frontonasal process or prominence. So coming on to the development of the face proper, we have the frontonasal process, and below the stomatium we have the first arch, that is a mandibular arch. Lateral to this stomatium we have the maxillary prominence. So the face is developing from the frontonasal process, maxillary prominence, and the mandibular prominence. And so for the development of the face, this is the frontonasal process, and here we have the first pharyngeal arch, and here is a stomatium, and this first pharyngeal arch or the mandibular arch, it will divide into a maxillary process and a mandibular process. So here you can see that this is a maxillary process and this is a mandibular process. So the maxillary process, it is not coming and getting fused, this one, whereas a mandibular process, it is coming and it is getting fused. Now what are the things that are happening to the frontonasal prominence? Here you can see there is a thickening forming, and this is the nasal placard. So lateralmost thickening you have the lens placard. This will form the lens of the future eye. With the formation of the nasal placard, it will form a pit or a groove, that is a nasal pit or the groove which communicate with the stomatium. So with the formation of the groove, it gets thickened laterally as well as medially. So the lateral thickening is called as the lateral nasal process, whereas the thickenings in medially is called as medial nasal process. So with the formation of the medial and lateral nasal process, these nasal pit, they will try to get approximated. That means they will try to come nearer, so that the frontonasal process here become thinned out. So when they are getting approximated, this medial nasal process, they will get fused near the midline. So here you can see that once the nasal pit is getting approximated, the lens placard will become anteriorly. So here you can see that this is the lateral nasal process and this is the maxillary process. So you can see that there is a groove which is present between the lateral nasal process and the maxillary process. And you can see that this is the stomatium. This is the future eye, and there is a connection between the future eye and the stomatium. So this groove is called as the naso-optic furrow. Naso-optic furrow. That means this naso-optic furrow, it is a gap which is found between the lateral nasal process and the maxillary process. And this naso-optic furrow, it gets filled with a ectoderm. And this can be seen as a cord which is extending from the stomatium to the future eye. In future, this cord will canalize. That is, a canal will develop and form the nasolacrimal duct. So this nasolacrimal duct will be from the conjunctival sac to the inferior meatus of the nose. I will repeat once more, it's worth repeating. So initially the maxillary process and the lateral nasal process, they are separated by a deep furrow. We can call it as this is a nasolacrimal groove, or it can be called as nasolacrimal furrow. So the ectoderm in the floor of this groove, it will form a solid epithelial cord. In future, this solid epithelial cord, it will canalize. And canalize means, it means that there is an opening. So it forms the nasolacrimal duct, and its upper end widen to form the lacrimal sac. And this nasolacrimal duct, it runs from the medial corner of the eye to the inferior meatus of the nasal cavity. And this maxillary prominence, it will enlarges to form the cheek and the maxilla. And the upper lip are formed from this is the medial nasal process and maxillary process. The maxillary process will grow towards the midline and fuses with the medial nasal process to form the upper lip. Even though we are saying that the upper lip is formed by the medial nasal process and the maxillary process, the skin part over the philtrum, it is derived from the ectoderm of the maxillary process. So we can say that the entire skin of the upper lip, it is formed from the ectoderm of maxillary process. So this is the reason behind why the skin over the upper lip or the philtrum, it is supplied by the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. So actually the trigeminal nerve, which is supplying the face, it is having ophthalmic division, maxillary division and the mandibular division. Ophthalmic division will supply the frontonasal process. The maxillary division will be supplying the maxillary process, and the mandibular division will be supplying the mandibular process, the sensory supply. So this is a take-home point that even though the upper lip is formed by the frontonasal process as well as the maxillary process, the skin over the upper lip or over the philtrum, it is formed by the ectoderm of the maxillary process. That is why it is supplied by the maxillary division of the trigeminal. So we can say that we have the frontonasal process and the maxillary process, which is forming the upper lip. The mandibular process will join in the midline to form the lower lip, and the maxillary process, which is mainly giving rise to cheek region. We have the frontonasal process, upper part, giving rise to the forehead. This lateral nasal process, it forms the ala of nose, whereas the medial nasal process, it forms the tip of nose. The nasal pit, it is occluded by the fusion of the medial nasal as well as the lateral nasal process, so that the nasal pit, it is getting converted into the future anterior nostrils. So going on to its applied aspects. So if this groove, nasolacrimal groove, if it is not getting obliterated, so you can see in a newborn a cleft is developing between the eyes and the mouth. So that defect is called as the facial cleft. So here there is failure of fusion of the maxillary process as well as the lateral nasal process, and it results in the facial cleft. This can be unilateral or it can be bilateral. Then in the beginning you can see that the maxillary process as well as the mandibular process, they are situated laterally in the very beginning. So these are called the lateral angles. So in the future, when the maxillary process, it grows towards the center, the lateral angle also shift and the future mouth is small. compared to the previous oral cavity in the beginning. Sometimes if the fusion doesn't happen, the oral cavity in such child will be larger, and that condition is called as macrostomia. That means larger mouth. So here there is a failure of fusion of the maxillary process as well as a mandibular process. So the lateral angle will stays there. So this is a condition of the macrostomia, as due to the failure of the fusion of the maxillary process as well as the mandibular process, so that the lateral angle stays there and it results in larger mouth, that is macrostomia. So here you can see, if there is undue fusion of the maxillary process as well as the mandibular process, there will be smaller mouth, that is this condition. This is called the microstomia. So the macrostomia is resulting from due to the failure of the fusion of the maxillary as well as the mandibular process. So the lateral angle is staying there. It is not coming to the normal position. Whereas in the case of microstomia, due to the abnormal fusion, that is, it is beyond the normal position. So it is microstomia. This is called as the cleft upper lip. It can also be called as hair lip. Here there is the failure of fusion of the maxillary process as well as with the medial nasal process. This is a condition of the cleft which is present in the lower lip. It is due to the failure of fusion of the mandibular process. This is the case of the midline cleft in the upper lip. Here you can see the philtrum is absent. It is due to the failure of the fusion of the medial nasal process. So winding up the session, we have the frontonasal process, maxillary, mandibular, medial nasal process, lateral nasal process. So this frontonasal process will form the forehead, and it also contribute for the formation of medial nasal and the lateral nasal process. The maxillary process will form the cheek and the lateral portion of the upper lip, whereas the mandibular process will form the lower lip and the jaw. It will also form the jaw. The medial nasal process will form the tip of the nose and the philtrum of the upper lip, whereas the lateral nasal process will form the ala of nose. So thank you.